Hello friends, this is Growl. In this video, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about playing Resto Druid in Mythic Plus for Dragonflight. Resto Druid was the first healer I pushed high keys on, so even though I didn't get too much of a chance to play it during the Shadowlands, it still holds a special place in my heart. Druid is looking very strong on the beta right now for dungeons and raids, so I was happy to de-rust mine and spend some time learning the class again. Restoration Druid is primarily a heal over time based healer. This classifies it as a more reactionary healer, so it may seem a bit difficult if you're just learning the class or the dungeons. Once you get the hang of things though, the amount of consistent healing Druid can put out is unmatched. Druid is one of the most flexible healers in terms of 5-mans. It has good consistent single target healing, good AoE healing, strong cooldowns, but it can still do healing outside of those cooldowns. It also has a toolkit of amazing utility like Battle Res and Soothe, while also bringing a party buff in Mark of the Wild. Overall, there's really not too much to dislike about the Resto toolkit, but before we jump into the rotation, let's quickly go over some setup basics for your character. Your race doesn't matter too much, but since it gets asked often, I would play Night Elf for Alliance or Troll for Horde. Race just isn't a big deal, but as a healer, being able to use the Night Elf Shadow Meld out of mechanics or dangerous situations to drink or just res can come in handy. As for stats, your number one is going to be Haste. Haste not only improves your heal and damage over time effects, but it just allows you to cast faster and get out more hots when you start to fall behind. 30% haste is a good number to shoot for, but this is mostly preference. My rule is, unless you're running out of mana, the more haste the better. After that, I would just be shooting for your highest item level piece as long as it has haste on it. All of your stats are generally good for Druid. I wouldn't be dropping item levels to try and get more haste. For a healing focused setup, you want to prioritize mastery after that haste, and then crit, and then finally verse. If you do want to maximize damage though, you want to completely skip mastery altogether and prioritize crit and then verse. I'll let you make that decision for yourself, but honestly you can't go wrong with just high haste and item level. Druids have access to several pretty strong trinkets depending on what you can get to drop. The Flask of the Solemn Night is a great haste trinket that drops from Court of Stars in Season 1 and pairs pretty well with just about anything. As a defensive option, Broodkeeper's Promise puts a heal over time and verse buff on you and another target. I think this trinket will be a solid choice for almost any healer, as the buff is super useful on your tank. Moat of Sanctification is another great defensive option. It's heavy mastery with a burst party heal on use. This will hurt your damage a lot though, so it might not be something I'd use unless I felt I needed it. As for offensive options, Eye of Skovald or Furious Rage Feather were both doing okay damage for me in keys. I wouldn't say any of these trinkets are mandatory, but if you're looking to farm one out, I'd probably start with the Flask in Court of Stars once Mythic Plus opens. There are several builds and keys that would work for Druid depending on the scenario and how much utility you need. I'd encourage you to experiment with different setups. The most important things for me are the two capstone nodes at the bottom, Protector of the Pack and Nature's Vigil. They provide a ton of damage, and any build that gives them up will be doing less. Build number one is the high key build that I was running. It has good damage, good survivability, but lacks some useful utility like Skull Bash or Improved Roar. This is something I would mainly run in coordinated groups or specific dungeons where I knew I was going to need that survivability. Build number two is a pretty fun build for pugs, maybe lower level keys, that probably does the highest damage output in both single target and AoE. But it's kind of a monkey build in that it sacrifices utility and survivability. By going along the full left side, getting all the cap form stuff and skipping Wild Charge, you can save some points and then get some Moonkin spells in order to do even more ranged DPS and have stronger convokes. Build number three is what I'd consider like the pug climbing build. You end up sacrificing some damage, but you bring a ton of disruption in the form of Skull Bash and Maim. This should give you more control over stopping those important casts and preventing wipes. You can also take a shorter cooldown Roar to make up for some of the time lost from that lack of damage. As for the spec tree, I think there isn't too much deviation we'll see in Mythic Plus. Many of the talents aren't super great for 5-mans and are mostly focused on raiding. I do want to go over a few passives in the build so that you get an idea of how it synergizes and how it should be played. Verdancy, when Life Bloom blooms, 3 targets in your FLO are healed. Harmonious Blessing, Life Bloom counts for 3 stacks of your mastery. Budding Leaves, Life Bloom healing is increased each time it heals, and the final bloom amount is also increased. Undergrowth, you may Life Bloom 2 targets at once. And finally, Photosynthesis, your periodic heals have an increased chance to cause your Life Bloom to bloom, and when Life Bloom is on yourself, your periodic heals heal faster. Your Life Bloom is going to be super juiced. Most of the time it will be on you and the tank, but you can spread it around when needed. Life Bloom is going to pump out tons of consistent healing at a very low mana cost to supplement your stronger spot healing with spells like Swift Mend and Nature Swiftness. The main flex points in the tree are going to be top right, Omen, and Flash of Clarity. These I found useful for some of the longer, tough boss fights if I'm worried about mana and I'm having to press regrowth. A lot of the situations, though, you're hardly using regrowth, so these points can go towards other parts of the tree if you wanted to try something like Dream State or maybe Nourish. Now that you're set up, we can start talking about our rotation. The key to Resto Druid is having a strong, hot priority. I like to think of them almost as lines of defense. Your first line of defense is your Adaptive Swarm, your Cenarian Ward, and your FLO. You should do your best to maintain these spells and keep them active all the time no matter what. These will be doing a huge chunk of your healing and also don't take nearly as long to maintain. As your party starts to take damage, you want to throw out your Life Blooms right away. As needed, you can also use Rejuve for single target healing or Wild Growth for party healing. This is your second line of defense. They're generally mana efficient spells, but you shouldn't really be spamming Rejuve and Wild Growth all the time. If this still isn't enough, that's when you break out the bigger guns. For single target healing, that's when you want to use Swift Mend or Nature Swiftness and then eventually Regrowth. For AoE healing, you'll end up wanting to use a major cooldown, something like Flourish, Convoke, or Tranquility. As you get more comfortable with healing, you'll have a better idea of when exactly you should use those major cooldowns, but for starters, I think it's helpful to think of things like this anyway. Which cooldown you use sort of depends on the situation. Let's say you have a lot of time to ramp up hots, you always want to prefer Flourish, since it's only going to be effective when you have all those hots in play. If you know you can safely just stand still the whole channel, then it's probably a good time to use Tranquility. And then for more flexible or unknown situations, Convoke is a safer bet, but it does happen to be the weakest of the 3. As for damage rotation, this can be a bit complicated depending on what talents you have, so I'll try and give a short guideline on it. On single target, your goal should be to maintain as many dots as possible, Moonfire, Sunfire, as well as any feral dots that you have talented. You use Shred and Cat form, or Wrath and Human form as your fillers, but it's not super often you'll have a lot of time to press those while healing. Once you get to 2 or more targets, you'll start using Swipe instead of Shred to build combo points if you have that talented. If you reach 5 combo points, it's always worth it to use your Rip depending on the amount of targets because it just does so much damage as long as that target's going to live for the full duration. Swipe's damage in Dragonflight is incredibly low, considering that it falls off after 5 targets. In many situations, it's often actually better to just spread Moonfire on as many mobs as you can, instead of going into Cat form. Cat form is primarily used for single target, and then at the end of a pull when your dots will quickly fall off. However, you can use Cat form to get your Thrash active, especially on really big pulls. Remember now, you can cast Star Surge and Starfire in human form. This means it's almost never worth it to go into Moonkin form unless you know that you're going to be able to cast in it unhindered for something like 15 seconds straight. The only reason for Moonkin form is when you're going to use Convoke, as you'll have a chance to proc Full Moon or Starfall. I want to talk a bit about your utility as Druid now. If you have the bottom left capstone, Incapacitating Roar is an AoE stop on a 30-second cooldown. Since you may not have Skull Bash or Typhoon, this is going to be your go-to stop if there are mobs nearby casting dangerous abilities. Stampeding Roar is a massive 60% move speed boost to you and your party every 2 minutes. Some of the new dungeons are quite big, and move speed could have a noticeable effect on your dungeon timer. With talents, you now have Iron Bark on a shorter cooldown, so don't be afraid to use this on your tank very often. You can have it on them at least every other trash pull. Another big utility with not much to talk about is the battle res. If your allies die, you can res them in combat, and it's very nice to have. Don't forget you can also use Nature Swiftness on that res for an instant cast in an emergency. There's also tons of small but helpful spells, stuff like Ursul's Vortex, Stealth, and Soothe that all have situational uses. Lastly, I want to give some helpful tips on how to use some spells that might be a bit unclear. First is Adaptive Swarm. This spell is absolutely one of your most powerful abilities in the dungeon. Not only will it deal incredible amounts of healing and DPS in a run, but it also speeds up nearly all of your other heal and DPS abilities as well. Use it on cooldown from the start of the key all the way till the end. The best use of it is on an ally that already has 2 or 3 stacks. The goal is to get a 5 stack of the swarm so that it has a chance to split into 2 different 4 stacks. If you keep stacking them up to 5, eventually you'll get the whole party covered. You can even start stacking it before the key starts in some instances. As for Nature's Vigil, personally I just macroed it with Flourish. They're both a 90-second cooldown and should be used when you have a lot of healing going on. Right before I want to use Flourish, I want to first reapply the 2 Life Blooms as well as Cenarian Ward if you have it available. Then I'll use Swift Mend anywhere I can just to get a boosted Wild Growth on my party, and then Wild Growth immediately into Flourish. The Wild Growth's healing, however, does not transfer into that Nature's Vigil damage, but it does do a ton of party healing when it's boosted with Flourish. Druid is an incredibly deep class with lots of stuff to min-max, but I think that about covers what I want to talk about in this first guide. I hope it was helpful. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments. I'll try to get to them when I can. I'm planning on doing an advanced high key guide with more specific tips and tricks that I learn once I get more experience healing high keys in this expansion. So if that's something that interests you, be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss it. Thanks again for watching, friends, and happy keying.